California's Monterey Peninsula, a name synonymous with high style and gracious living. Each year, the Pebble Beach Country Club hosts what is acknowledged to be the world's foremost automotive concours d'elegance. In 1997, the featured marque was Aston Martin, and the concours organisers assembled one of the finest and most representative gatherings of Aston Martins ever seen. The earliest example of the marque on hand was this 1925 Brooklands Racer, brought over from Japan by Norihiro Takahashi. Success on the banked Brooklands track often brought paying customers into the showrooms in the affluent and sporting atmosphere of 20s Britain, so Aston Martin founders Lionel Martin and Robert Bamford pinned their hopes on this little racing car. It was successful in the famous Brooklands 200-mile race, but not successful enough to ensure the company's survival. Despite good performances in continental road races, the car didn't sell in enough numbers to prevent the collapse of Aston Martin in late 1925. Entered by Tom Dunsworth from St. Louis, Missouri. Sports versions finished first and second in their class, and fifth and seventh overall in the famous Le Mans 24-hour race that year. The driver of the Le Mans car that finished second in class in 1933 was one of the new directors of the company, A.C. Bert Bertelli, who instigated the design of this 1934 sports saloon. Using the same 1500cc engine as the open sports cars, it was an attempt to broaden the appeal of the Aston marque. This superb example was shipped from England for Pebble Beach by its owner, Keith Piper. In 1934, Aston Martin scored another class win at Le Mans, linked with a splendid third place overall. As well as the Le Mans success, they also won their class in the Tourist Trophy race held on the roads of Northern Ireland, and again placed third overall against the bigger engined opposition. That's why this 1935 model, owned by Rob Burt of Princeton, New Jersey, became known as the Ulster, one of the most famous Aston Martin model names. Meanwhile, Aston Martin had also continued with cars aimed at the sporting road driver rather than the racers. Cars like this 1937 Drophead Coupe, with coachwork by Abbott and now owned by Robert Stockman from St. Augustine, Florida. By this time, Aston had developed a 2-litre version of their 4-cylinder engine. It had more pulling power to cope with the heavy bodywork of the Roadsters. And this is one of the rarest Astons of all. Owner Tom Rollison gives us the details.
It's designed with a total integral box frame structure, which formed the basis of the DB1s and particularly the DB2s, and went all the way through to the Superleggera design, where it went from into aluminium tube at that stage. It also had the very first Gordon Armstrong front suspension, which was fully independent, had a parallel linkage design, which made very good steering geometry, which again was incorporated in the DB2s in the 2.4s. It also had the very first Salisbury back axle used by Astons, which again was used all the way through to the 1960s. And the car therefore formed a basis of really most of the post-war Astons through to the DB6. So in that sense, it was a very, very important set of design criteria. It is not well known, this particular point, in that it was originally designed to be a 1941 Le Mans entrant. At that time, it was considered that a 4-door saloon class would be a new class which Astons had a very good chance of winning, and that's the reason for the very short rear door on the car. Of course, with World War II, that race never took place. But certainly with the technical spec of the car and its performance, it would have been a very strong contender in the 2-litre class at the time. The car has got the very first DB1 prototype engine. It is a pushrod engine of 4 cylinders, and what was a major set of design changes from Aston, which had always been into overhead cams. The engine had got enormous design potential. It was first put into the car in 1944. It's got inclined valves, it's got timing chains at the rear of the engine, which makes servicing easier. It's got a solid drive off those for the water pump, so in racing, if the fan belt went, again, you'd have water circulation. The other features of the engine was it went through into the Spa car, and it ran in that race and actually won with very little development in the post-war period. So it was a very underdeveloped engine in many ways, because when David Brown bought the company, the W.O. Bentley twin overhead cam engine was then put into the DB2s, and this engine was then shelved. But it's currently pushing out something like about 100 brake horsepower, but that's off a very low compression ratio, which was geared to wartime poor petrol. But it still makes the car capable of 110 miles an hour, and that's running off a 6.1 compression ratio. So it was quite a remarkable performance for what essentially is a totally undeveloped engine. 37 of them were built between this engine and the final cessation of the DB1, most of which never went into cars. So in that sense, it's still a very, very rare engine indeed in production terms. Basically, the car itself was the brainchild of Gordon Sutherland, who'd owned the factory from 1933 to 1947, when the factory was then sold to David Brown. The engine itself was designed by Claude Hill, and he and Gordon Sutherland indeed designed the unique motif on the bonnet of the car, which was half an Aston badge, and they were very keen in aircraft design as well, and so that formed an amalgam of features. And indeed, a number of the aspects of the car bring in a little bit of aircraft technology, such as the hammock seats in the car as well, which are extremely comfortable. Perhaps has never been fully recognised, but the mere fact it won at Spa in '48 maybe is recognition enough.
By 1949, Aston Martin was under its 4th owner. Millionaire British industrialist David Brown had bought both Aston Martin and Lagonda 2 years previously. With the Lagonda acquisition came a new 6-cylinder overhead camshaft engine. It had been designed under the supervision of Lagonda's engineering director, the famous W.O. Bentley. Another talented designer, Frank Feely, also came over to Aston from the Lagonda design department. The combination of their talents resulted in this car, the beautiful and speedy DB2. The Pebble Beach Concours car is one of the earliest 1949 prototypes, now owned by Rhode Island enthusiast Derek Durst. Intended as a road car, the DB2 was also capable of running well in sports car races, just like its predecessors in the 30s. The DB2 scored respectable class placings in the endurance racing events at Le Mans, Spa and Monza. British coach builders Mulliner made the Feely-designed bodywork for the production DB2-4 models, like this 1954 version, owned by Richard J. Sirota from upstate New York. Not surprisingly, the Aston Martin DB2-4 caught the eye of the Italian specialist coach builders and their wealthy clients, who were prepared to pay way over the odds for something unique. On display at Pebble Beach were 4 extremely rare Astons, rebodied by the famous Bertoni design group in Turin. This was believed to be the first time that all these unique Aston Martins had been gathered together. From Kansas City, Missouri, came James B. Vandergrift with this 1953 Bertoni-style drop-head coupe on DB2-4 running gear. Also based on the DB2-4 is this 2-seater Bertoni Spider, brought from Danville, California by Don Williams. A later car, but still utilizing the Aston Martin DB2-4 as its base, is this stylish Bertoni coupe from 1957. was driven up the California coast from Santa Barbara by owner Roger Carlson. Last in this unique Bertone quartet was later still a DB4 GT from 1961 with beautiful, sporting and elegant Berlinetta coachwork. The fortunate owner is H.P. Weidmann from Basel in Switzerland. By this time, Frank Feely had retired and Aston Martin themselves were having their bodies styled in Italy. Touring of Milan with the selected designers and their bodywork for the DB4 GT, like this one owned by Robert Leiber of Hamburg in Germany, made it a true 60s classic. The Aston Martin DB4 also caught the eye of other Italian stylists, notably Zagato. They came up with what many people still feel is the best looking Aston Martin ever, the gorgeous DB4 GTZ, colloquially known as the Zagato GT. Only a handful of these cars were ever built. Jerry F. Rosenstock of Encino, California, is the owner of the Italian Racing Red example on display at Pebble Beach. The light weight of the Zagato model, combined with its more powerful GT version of the DB4 six-cylinder engine, made it the choice of the leading Aston racing teams in the GT class that was so popular in the early 60s. The most famous Zagato GT of all was the one which carried the British registration number 2VEV and was driven in events like the TT at Goodwood by the late great Jim Clark. To the delight of all the Aston Martin enthusiasts at Pebble Beach, the current owner of 2VEV, David Isles, had brought the car over from his home in Beaconsfield in England. In 1962, Aston Martin returned to Le Mans with an official factory entry, the DP212. It was the first of 3 prototypes which were to become known as the Project cars. Today, DP212 is owned by Viscount Down. London collectors Simon Draper and Anthony Smith own the 1963 developments in the Project car trio, DP214 and DP215. DP212 had briefly held second place at Le Mans before retiring with engine trouble, but the car ran long enough to point up some aerodynamic deficiencies which caused rear-end instability at high speeds. Flat tails and upturned rear spoilers solved the problem in the 1963 cars. So much so that Phil Hill was timed at 197 miles per hour in DP215 at Le Mans and said it was so stable that at that speed he could have driven it a GT endurance race at Monza and had the satisfaction of beating the hitherto all-conquering Ferrari 250 GTOs on their home ground. Prior to this era of GT racing, with cars loosely based on production road models, Aston Martin had concentrated on the pure sports racing class, with a great deal of success. Typical of the era is the DB3S owned by Christopher Sawyer of Oklahoma City, and shown at Pebble Beach in the official white and blue racing livery of the United States. The DB3S was always a front runner in the 3-litre class in the mid-50s, and often a contender for outright honours, despite the presence of bigger engine cars from Jaguar, Ferrari and Maserati. Major successes were outright wins in the Goodwood 9-hour race and the Tourist Trophy on the Dundrod Road Circuit in Northern Ireland, as well as leaderboard placings here at the Nürburgring and at Le Mans. The successor to the DB3S was the DBR1, this car being another from the collection of Viscount Down. In 1959, the DBR1 gave Aston Martin both the World Sports Car Championship and a Le Mans 24-hour race win, although the season didn't start too well when Carroll Shelby retired from the Sebring 12 Hours with clutch trouble. 3 months later, however, he and partner Roy Salvadori were well recompensed for this setback by scoring the victory at Le Mans which David Brown had lusted after for so long. It was this win, plus others in the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometres and the Goodwood TT, that iced the Aston Martin cake with the world title. After 46 years, 4 different owners, and a massive personal investment by David Brown, Aston Martin could finally claim to be the best racing sports cars in the world. Held on the same weekend as the Pebble Beach Concours are the Monterey Historic Automobile Races on the nearby Laguna Seca racetrack. The honoured driver for 1997 was none other than Carroll Shelby. Carroll had to take an early retirement from racing due to heart problems, but since he has had both a heart and a kidney transplant. Now in his 70s, he looks fit and strong, and one of his main interests these days is the foundation he set up to help young children with heart problems. At Laguna, Shelby was busy raising money for this worthy cause, and it was something to which his legions of fans were more than prepared to contribute.
The years that I drove for Aston Martin were the years that I was planning to build my own car. And Aston Martin and John Wire and all the people, the engineers at Aston Martin, are the ones that helped me learn how to build a Cobra. And I always wanted to build my own car. I wanted to use an American V8. You could put 300, 400 horsepower. An American engine, and that's where I learned to do it at Aston Martin, working around with the mechanics there during all those years. So Aston had a lot to do with the cars that I've built since, and the reason that I'm here today.
That's terrific. The other reason you're here today is your charitable foundation. Tell us about that. It's a fantastic story.
Yes, it's John Ashburn runs the English side of it. You know, he's head of Addenbrooke's hospital in Cambridge, and the reason that I formed it was I was laying in the hospital waiting for a heart transplant, and young children both died on each side of me waiting for a heart, and I decided, here's an old man 67 years old that's lucky enough to get one, and God must be saying something. So I've made my mind up that I'm going to try to help children with cardiac problems, and that's probably my #1 project in life. I love my cars, but to see that the children get some help when so many programs from the governments fall through the crack, and that's the reason for my foundation. It's not a large foundation, but all the money goes to the kids. I'm very proud of it. We've helped a lot of young people, but that's the reason for it.
Accompanying Carroll Shelby at Laguna Seca was the actual DBR1 that he and Roy Salvadori took to victory at Le Mans. Now under the care of historic racing car specialist Tim Samways, the Aston was in winning form again at Laguna, 38 years down the road. Tim prepared the car perfectly for its reunion with Shelby, and Briton Peter Hardman took it to an appropriate victory in the weekend's main sports car race. And it wasn't only Shelby's old car that was at Laguna to bring back the memories. So were 3 of his old mates from the Aston Martin days. Roy Salvadori, Sterling Moss and Paul Frere all joined Aston Martin's managing director Bob Dover in making a presentation to Carroll on the Laguna Seca start line.
The car that I've just been driving with Carroll was the best Aston they ever made. That was a beautifully balanced car, superb brakes, and I think everybody agreed it was their best product.
It was certainly the best of all the sports racing cars I drove in the 50s. Driving into the corners was sharp and very precise. And then it had rack and pinion steering, which was more more sensitive than the Ferrari.
In 1958, when I believe we had the 3-litre formula, so it put us in the same ball game as other cars. Previous to that, we had to compete against the 3.945 Ferrari, the 4.5-litre Maserati, 3.8 Jaguars. For the first time, we were on a 3-litre limit, so we were in with chances. The thing that spoilt the 1958 season was the fact that we were locking up in gears. We'd jam in fourth, and we couldn't get out of fourth, and the gearbox wasn't the most pleasant gearbox, and that lost Aston's quite a few races. When we got into 1959, to a great extent, they'd solved their problems. It wasn't the easiest gear change, but at least, you know, it was a reliable gearbox, and it would be there at the end of the race. And that's why we were successful in 59. I would have thought that without the gearbox troubles in 58, we probably would have won Le Mans then. It was good because we won, Carroll and I won. It was bad because DB then achieved his ambition, which was to win Le Mans, and stopped sports car racing. So you take it from there.
After David Brown had pulled Aston Martin out of sports car racing, Salvadori went on to partner Shelby in the Aston Martin Grand Prix car.
Well, Carroll and I drove that for the 59-60 season, and to be truthful, they missed out with that because they'd had the car under sheets in 1957. I tested the car in 57. It was a supercar then. They wouldn't race it because they were putting all their effort into the sports car racing. When they decided to race it, it was the era of the rear engine car. And although we had a damn good car, and it was very competitive against any front engine car, it wasn't as good as the rear engine car. And progressively, the difference was greater. We were falling back. So it was a shame, really. They had the car when they had possible chances of winning the World Championship, but never raced it.
Grand Prix legend Stirling Moss contributed to Aston Martin's World Sports Car Championship by winning at the Nürburgring and at Goodwood.
The Aston of that era was terrific. The DBR1, I think, was probably as good an Aston as I've ever driven. They started with the DB3S, and then of course we improved it and then changed it, and then became the DBR1. And I think it was not at Le Mans particularly, because I reckon the test of a real test of a sports car is Nürburgring. And to be able to go to Nürburgring and win 1,000 Ks with the DBR1, as in fact we did, shows just how great the car was. From the point of view of the driver, it was a lot more fun, because I mean Nürburgring is a place where it's only 6 or 7 hours, you're allowed to have a go, you can race. Le Mans, it's a Grand Prix of endurance, and you can't race, you've got to take it easy, look, you've got 24 hours. It's a great event, but from a driver's point of view, it's not the same sort of enjoyment, shall I say, that I got at Nürburgring. I race because I love racing, and to drive for Astons was great because you could talk to them, and you could go, you'd sort of say, let's go and do this race or that, and one would negotiate with John Wyer or David Brown, depending on who it was, and go to good circuits. I think David Brown contributed a lot because of his enthusiasm of the sport. People say you never make money if you own Astons, and I think probably until now, Astons haven't really had a car that was as marketable as they do now. I think that the heritage of what Aston Martin are is now beginning to show through in what is without doubt their finest road car, the DB7.